Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending what time you happen to be listening to this on. For Wednesday, September the 2nd, 2015, you're listening to Thoughts, Comments, Opinions. Today, we tackle as important a subject as we have ever looked at on this show. The guest today is Julien Mercille, who is the co-author of a vitally important book called Deepening Neoliberalism, Austerity and Crisis. The book itself happens to take Ireland as a case study, but the whole issue of the rise of corporate capitalism, the loss of democratic rights, the true class warfare that is going on. Yes, these are weighty themes. They affect your life. Ireland is the case study. The problem, and it is a problem, is worldwide. So sit back, relax, fire up a podtini, and listening to some fairly frightening words as they fly through the air. We'll be right back. Mercille is lecturer at the School of Geography, Planning and Environmental Policy at University College Dublin, Ireland. He has published widely in topics such as the financial crisis, U.S. foreign policy, media studies, and drugs policy from a political economy perspective. His current research interests include political economy, neoliberalism, the mass media, and economic crises. Julien, welcome to Thoughts, Comments, Opinions. How are you?
Thank you. Very good.
Excellent, and glad to hear. The book is a very deep and academic study of the economic and social crises that we're facing around the world. I just want to quote two sentences from it because I think that will be a good departure point for us in discussing this. You say in the book, government spending cuts and tax hikes, privatization, reforms to reduce labor protections and wages all translate into a reassertion of power on the part of elites over ordinary people. Austerity is thus a political class project designed to roll back the welfare state and redistribute income upwards. How did we come to this?
Well, the last few years have been they're a good case study for that because they are an intensification of what you just said. So when the crisis struck, when the housing bubble collapsed, in a way it was a good pretext for elites in Ireland and Europe to reassert their power and do a range of things like cut funding for public services or raise taxes, protect corporate powers, and in a time of crisis, it's kind of it provides a reason or a pretext because there was a lot of financial turbulence, and there were more than one way to deal with that. But the way that chose to deal with it is through austerity, and that's exactly what austerity mandates, to increase the power of people who are already in power and make ordinary people to pay for the damage.
Something that I find hard to understand is that Keynesian economics, the Bretton Woods monetary stabilization tied to the gold standard and so forth, worked perfectly well through, through the post-war period until around 1980 or so. Why did that ever change? If something isn't broke, why fix it?
Yeah, well, there's debate on that. Like you said, in the 50s and 60s, we had a Keynesian political economy in most Western countries. And then for the last 30 years or so, we moved towards a neoliberal one, which is more giving more power to corporate interests. The transition between the two, there's a lot of debate about that. Some people say it's because workers were very assertive in the 70s, and then there was a fiscal crisis of the states as well. So the thing that's clear is that corporate power reacted to that in a way seeking to reassert their power. And then we have a shift towards increasing capital mobility, for example, corporate freedoms in general, repressing wages so that it translates into higher profits for corporations, making labor more flexible so you can fire your workers more easily than before, they're less protected. So a range of things like that have happened. Have they been successful in restoring corporate power? To some extent, yes, but the general economic growth was much better before in the 50s and 60s, but things were more egalitarian at that time. At least the trend was towards building social services like the NHS or social security and things like that, whereas in the last 30 years we've witnessed attempts at dismantling those social nets, if you will.
Indeed, yes. One thing that we should mention is that although the book focuses on Ireland, the subtitle is Europe's Treasure, Ireland. Ireland is really a case study for what is a global phenomenon, yes?
Yeah.
Indeed. The reaction to the economic crisis, the bank bailouts, etc., in 2008. Again, something that I find interesting is that we didn't revert back to being Keynesians, which in simple terms, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in times of crisis, governments spend to restore a balance to the economy. We went into more austerity and neoliberalism. Why didn't the Keynesians rise again?
Well, that's, I mean, maybe apart from personalities and things like that on the part of European leaders, Europe took a much more austerity heavy approach than the US, for example, and that's why the US had a shorter recession and has been doing better since then than Europe. Europe is the opposite. It's been stagnating virtually for 6 years now. One thing specific to Europe is the Eurozone, right? Architecture that is inherently neoliberal and pro-business because countries like Ireland, individual countries, they lose the capacity to print their own money, for example, so they're stuck with a currency they don't really control, and it's set by, let's say, Germany or European corporate power, and that encourages more of more austerity policies, and also within the European Union, we have a lot of regulations, which we talk about in the book, that are, for example, they mandate countries to have low deficits, and you can't have deficit spending too much in terms of crisis. In times of crises, so all that there are regulations put in place, layer by layer, year by year, and in the end, it's true that if you're in Ireland, if you're a Eurozone country, you have some alternatives, but you don't have that much flexibility as you would have had outside the Eurozone. So maybe the case of Greece recently illustrates that better because of the debate, should we get out of the Eurozone or not? If we stay in, we have to obey the Troika, and that's austerity. It's a bit the same thing for Ireland. So the architecture is set in place that if you want to have a more flexible crisis resolution policy, then you're limited within the Eurozone.
That is a really critical point that you bring up in the book, that national governments have given away a lot of their power to regulate their own economies to transnational bodies like IMF World Bank, etc., etc. How much can an individual nation within something like the EU, or we're both from Canada, within NAFTA, say, or the coming Pan-Pacific Economic Agreement, how much loss of power have individual nation states actually signed away?
Well, in the case of Ireland, a lot of key policy options, economic, have been given, if you will, to the Eurozone. I mean, it's not so much that giving power away is not too bad if it's done in a way that is to the advantage of ordinary people. Like, let's say a U.S. state has given a lot of power to Washington and to the Federal Reserve, but it's a much more egalitarian system. So it's what kind of powers you give away. If, let's say, in the Eurozone, you had the same arrangement, but you had, on top of that, you had much more redistribution of income from richer countries or richer regions to poorer ones or countries in crisis, then it'd be very different. And I don't think people would criticize as much the fact that we've given some fiscal or monetary powers to Brussels. The problem now is that we've given away some policy options, and the only thing we have left is to either get out of the Eurozone, or if you stay inside, you have to cut labor costs to gain competitiveness. And that's very harsh on most people who work. So it's in that way. So if you give away certain powers, it can be okay if you get back some benefits, but if you don't, then the problem is what we face in Ireland.
If Greece had left the euro, or if any individual state had, and I think a lot of people had the question on their minds worldwide, what actually would have happened either to, and we can say Greece or Ireland, pick whatever example you care for, what would have happened to that individual nation state? What would have happened to the EU/Euro in general, if anyone had actually left?
Yeah, if you leave, well, it's a bit speculative, but if you leave, then you regain, you could do deficit spending if you want. You can do away with austerity. You can print your own money. So those are important levers or policy options that you could have. Then it depends what you do after that. I mean, if you democratize the banking system, for example, you nationalize it in some way, like they were proposing in Greece, then you can regain sovereignty. I mean, it doesn't mean that it will work and be, perfect. The best option would be to stay in the Eurozone, but like I was saying, to have more redistribution inside it. So you reduce the financial chaos and you stop austerity. If you don't do that, then most likely you'll have a short period of a few months or half a year or something like that of economic recession or turbulence, and then your economy will grow back. That's what happened in Argentina 15 years ago when they left the peg with the US dollar, which would be a kind of equivalent to leaving the Eurozone. And then if you have power over, let's say you can devalue your currency because you don't have the euro anymore, well, you become more competitive. So that can boost your exports and boost your manufacturing sector. So that's one thing. If you do deficit spending, okay, if you do it forever, it's not good because you accumulate debt. But if you do it for a few years to get out of a recession, to increase demand and investment, then you can lead to growth. If you stay in the Eurozone, the problem is if you do austerity forever, you'll never grow. I mean, or maybe you'll grow a little bit, but it's not going to be much more and stagnant as we see in Greece. So that would be the potential outcome of getting out of the Eurozone.
Pardon me. One other thing I've noticed is that people, the general population, in general, seem to recognize this in terms of the widespread support for Syriza when it came to power. And I'm also watching at the time we're recording this the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party in the UK, with hundreds of thousands of people joining Labour. Yet, and I suppose we're leading into corporate ownership of media here. By and large, the mainstream media outlets truly tamp down the sort of populist, to my mind, sensible movements. What would you care to say about that?
Well, the populist movements, the reason they're cast as negatively or as dreamers or whatever is because they do challenge the establishment. They do challenge the order of the economy and the politics we have. So anybody who does that will be labeled as, in a negative way. So Corbyn or Syriza or Podemos or some of the left parties we have in Ireland, they really speak for ordinary people, and they want to challenge the establishment who's based their policies, their whole strategy on catering to the needs of the better off segments of the population, corporations and political elites. So that's why as soon as you do the opposite, you'll be criticized, and you won't get much time in the media, and you'll be isolated in a way.
The right-wing response to all this, and I'll be devil's advocate and wash my mouth out later, but the Scott Walkers, the Stephen Harpers, the Donald Trumps, and so on, the Wolfgang Schäubles, etc., would say, to countries that this is your fault. You overspent, so therefore, the adults have to come into the room and fix everything, by imposing austerity. Where do they have that argument wrong?
Well, the crisis was not caused by overspending. It was caused by a housing bubble collapsing. So it has nothing to do with government spending. Some governments in Europe, like Ireland and Spain, had a surplus, in fact. So government spending is not the cause of the crisis. It's a housing bubble, and that, I repeat it, but it's not stated often enough. So once you have a recession, the only thing you can do is that in the short term is that government has to step in and make up for the lost demand. So when you have a housing bubble collapsing, you lose demand because there's less construction and people lose their jobs and stuff like that. If the government doesn't step in, then there's less demand, and by definition, almost, it means that the economy will shrink. So that's, the best example to understand that. You were talking about Donald Trump in the U.S. World War II is what got the U.S. out of the Depression in the 30s. The reason is because the U.S. spent so much on the war that it then became the world's #1 economic power for 60, 70 years. So that's a good example showing how government stepping in will lead to growth. It doesn't have to do that for forever, but for the time needed to bring back demand, it's the way to do it. And again, we have a good example in the last few years. Europe did not do that. Very bad economy, stagnation. The US did austerity, but less than Europe, and they recovered faster and stronger.
You make a really good point in the book, and I'll ask you to expand on it, because here again, the right-wing argument, and I also in a bit will get into the left-right business as well, but The where was I going with this? That yeah, I'm going to go at it this way first. You mentioned World War II, taking the United States out of the Great Depression. Noam Chomsky, pardon me, who you mentioned in the book, and Chris Hedges and several others have pointed out that we're in a state of near permanent war now too, which of course is very good for corporate interests and so forth. How does that fit in, to the neoliberal economic argument?
Well, the permanent war thing, I mean, doesn't really apply to Ireland because it's very small military, but the US is that if you look at military spending in the US as a proportion of the economy or as absolute numbers, after World War II, right after World War II, it dropped dramatically because the war was over. And just a few years after, it went back up before the Korean War. And since then, it's been pretty constant. It varies, but over the long term, it's kind of constant. So it puts a floor under the economy of a constant source of government spending, and it brings demand to the economy, so it stimulates the economy. So that's one reason why you have so much military spending in the US. It's a way of guaranteeing, if you will, a substantial amount of economic demand. Doesn't mean you have wars all the time, but the military spending is always there, and a lot of products we have been developed through that, like the internet or satellites and computers and engines. They've all had some kind of push in innovation from military spending. So it's inefficient, of course, but it has some real positive impacts and products that come out of that.
I remember now the question that I was going to ask, and you address it very nicely in the book. The part of the right-wing argument, and they always unearth the corpse of Adam Smith for all this, is that they are trying to put the world in order so that market forces will prevail and the invisible hand will balance everything, etc., etc. You make the argument that neoliberalism is not truly about markets. Can you explain that?
Yeah, neoliberalism, again, it's the last 30, 40 years they're referred to as neoliberal years because you have an attempt by the corporate sector to reassert its power and increase corporate freedoms to move capital internationally and to make labor more flexible and fire workers more easily, repress wages and things like that. And all that contributes to increasing profits and corporate power. Sometimes it's done through markets, increasing marketization. So you have privatization, for example, of industries that were previously owned by the state, so that you can label that more markets and more markets. But there's other components that are not really about markets. It's more about power. So let's say monopoly rights, copyrights for medicines. Monopoly is not a market, it's the opposite of that. And that really helps corporations to raise profits and their power. The best example for that is during the crisis when you had the banking collapse or turbulence. The state stepped in and bailed out the banks. So that's completely anti-market. If you had a real market, you would not bail any business. You would just let them go bankrupt when they can't make ends meet, and you would start anew. But it's exactly the opposite. The state stepped in, forced taxpayers to pay the bondholders and save the banks. So that's a neoliberal move because it really contributes to increasing corporate power or protecting corporate power, but it has nothing to do with the market. It's exactly the opposite. So sometimes you have market instruments for under neoliberalism. Other times you have other instruments and policies that are either non-market or anti-market. So that's what we mean in the book.
I hardly agree, and I remember back in 2008 when the trillions of dollars and euros started to go into Goldman Sachs, etc., to bail them out. What was distressing then and is distressing now, and again I'll refer to Chris Hedges, who I had the pleasure of interviewing around the time that he wrote his book, The Death of the Liberal Class, is that there was precious little opposition within parliaments, congresses, dial, etc., to the bailouts. Whatever happened to the liberal political class?
Well, I mean, in Europe and elsewhere, we have those political parties that were social democrats or left-leaning, depending on the country. And under neoliberalism, one feature is that those groups that were more progressive or left-leaning, they've drifted towards the right, become more conservative, like Tony.
Oh, I see.
There, Labour in the UK and or the Labour Party in. Pardon me. Hello.
Yep. No, we're okay. Your voice dropped out for a moment, but you're back and fine. We are fine.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the Labour Party, as much in Ireland and in Britain, are good examples. They've drifted towards the right, and so right now, what's happening is that you have less of an opposition to conservative policies or pro-corporate policies, and that's why you have the rise of new parties like Podemos or even Sinn Féin in Ireland, Syriza. They took the place of the former so-called socialist parties, and they're trying to start something new, more progressive. So that's what happened to the liberal or social democratic party the last few decades.
Are you optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a double movement. Like I said in the book and in the interview, there's more moves by power, by elites to become stronger, but there's also a big counter reaction from new movements like Syriza, like Podemos, like Sinn Féin in Ireland, or Corbyn in the UK. And it's not new, but it's the scale of it, and the parties themselves are new. So there's a lot of activism going on. So there's like a bifurcation of politics or polarization. There's more progressive politicians, for example, get more support now than they did 10 years ago or before the crisis. So the water charges movement in Ireland is a very good example. So there's hope because there's activity. It's really moving. If for anybody who's involved in activism or protests in Ireland or Europe, there's a lot of things going on. It's not dead at all. So that gives grounds to be optimistic.
The last thing I'll ask, and I referred to it before, is that on the occasions I've had to write about this too, is that I've made the point that the lines of struggle, shall we say, are not horizontal. It's not left versus right. It's top versus bottom. It really is a class struggle. You make the point in the book as well, and I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, we talk a lot in terms of left, right, and there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, I agree with most of it. The top down, I think it's a good analogy for, especially when we talk about in Europe, oh, it's Germany against Greece or Germany against Ireland. I think there's a lot of truth in that. That Germany has interests, and they clearly lead the troika and try to push for austerity in periphery countries like Ireland. But there's the big dimension that I like to highlight also is, like you said, top-down, meaning European elites everywhere are in some kind of loose alliance against ordinary Europeans, ordinary people in all countries. So someone in Ireland has a lot of common interests with someone in Greece, for example. Maybe they don't know it, maybe they're very aware of it, I don't know, but there's a lot of, they're dealing with the same situation. And elites in Germany or Ireland, they have very, very similar interests. And that's why they never really disagree. Maybe they do on tactics sometimes, or maybe just for a show. But I mean, Enda Kenny doesn't really, if you got his policies, the coalition government we have, they don't really depart at all from what the Troika requires. They're very similar because they have the same interests. They're there to reduce democracy and make sure that decisions are taken among their own little circles, and favor, again, people already in power, whether it's corporate or political. That's what drives their policy. That's why I like to look at it in terms of, like you said, top-down. But left-right is also good, because on the left, a lot of that, a lot of what's left would say exactly what I said. It's about ordinary people versus elites. So that would be another good way to put it.
We'll keep our fingers crossed, and we'll keep on marching. The book is Deepening Neoliberalism, Austerity and Crisis, Europe's Treasure Ireland. Our guest has been its co-author, Julien Mercille. Julien, thank you ever so much for doing Thoughts, Comments, Opinions.
Thank you very much. Do you know when it'll be online, or?
Well, let's see. It will be online on my web pages later tonight. Then it will be going off to Hispanic News Online, so it'll be up there on the weekend, and on San Diego Book Review. They usually have them up in about 48 hours. And for the listeners, you may be listening to them on one of those. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Julien Mercille, for coming on Thoughts, Comments, Opinions today. If you have any comments yourself or feedback that you'd like to offer, feel free to contact us either through the comments section where you are listening to this podcast from, or you can always email us. We'll have the various addresses on the page. Thank you ever so much for listening. Next time, we're going to be discussing world cinema. Yes, on Thoughts, Comments, Opinions, we cover all the bases. And the last thing is that if there is any guest, any topic, anything at all that you'd like to hear discussed in our show, please let us know. But in the meantime, from over here in Ireland, for all of us who work the late shift, good night, everybody, and be seeing you.